have a special speaker, Dawn Montagna. She works for the World Wildlife Fund. You know that little upside-down panda that's one of the really important conservation agencies that we have here. Dawn is...
So I'm going to talk about WWF and environmental conservation. Environmental conservation in general is changing quite dramatically, both in the way that we do work, the kind of issues that we look at, the scale that we're addressing. WWF is it's a conservation organization, it's an advocacy organization. So we actually take positions on things and we lobby for them. It's a little bit different from some other organizations that just do research and make recommendations. We actually have a position, we take it and we push it in the international arena. We're also an NGO, and I don't know if any of you know what that is, a non-governmental organization. So when you think about the big decision makers out there, the ones that are really, say, driving the way the world looks today, you have the public sector, which is government, you have the private sector, which is your corporations, and then you have civil society, oftentimes you all, us, represented by non-governmental organizations. So that's sort of where WWF sits in the scheme of who does what out there in the world. And our particular focus, again, is on environmental conservation. So first of all, conservation is moving from site-based work to more larger scale units. So where work used to be done in, say, parks, protected areas, community forestry projects, we're now scaling up. And WWF works in what they call ecoregions, which are really looking at ecosystems. So instead of just looking at a very small isolated area, we're looking at sort of this larger scale ecosystem approach, which is much bigger and in many ways much more difficult, but we're finding that it's actually a much more appropriate scale to work on, because then we can look at the wider range of factors that are actually having an impact on conservation. But can anybody think about why working at this scale might be particularly difficult?
Huge.
What's that?
It's huge.
Yes. What about it being huge? Yeah.
A lot of political boundaries going over these different countries.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, that's one of the big reasons, especially if you're trying to do conservation, looking at policy issues. You could be looking at one ecoregion that encompasses 5 or 6 different countries with political boundaries, so it can get very tricky. The second aspect is that we're moving more, again, from local activities to policy-based work, and this is the work that I do. This is where I sit. And unfortunately, we're still struggling with that as well. Conservation over the last 40 years has meant mostly science-based work, site-based work. So we've got a great deal of capacity within the organization to do this aspect, but very little capacity to do the policy-based work. And so this is something that we're also struggling with as well. And it has huge implications for who we work with, where we work, who our partners are, what kind of language that we have to talk to people. It's very different. And there are a couple of things that are going on right now when I talk about sort of this larger scale global policy work. So what are the challenges? And when I say challenges, in this context, I really mean what are the threats that you think of in terms of what drives biodiversity loss? What is it that you think about when you say, oh, we're losing species or we're losing forests? What are some of the threats that come to mind? You just call it out. Deforestation, I heard. Okay, anything else?
Development.
What kind of, okay, development. Anything else?
Chemicals.
What's that?
Chemicals.
What about chemicals?
Pesticides.
Habitat degradation?
Overpopulation.
You could say overpopulation, population growth,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Trade and consumption.
Hey.
Invasive species.
What's that?
Invasive species.
Good one.
Yep. Anything else? Erosion. Good. Anything else?
Habitat fragmentation.
Fragmentation? Anything else?
Just water itself.
Okay. Okay.
Water, good point.
So I put these in 2 different columns. Does anybody know why? Well, this is actually, and you might notice that you have a few more on this side of the board than on this side of the board. This has been where we have typically been working in conservation. And the distinction that we make between these two is that these are the direct impacts and these are the indirect impacts. And the direct impacts are where we've been focusing for the last 40 years. We've said people are cutting the trees, we need to stop them cutting the trees. We're losing soil, how are we going to deal with soil loss? What do we do right here on the site? We've got pesticides flowing into the river, how are we going to stop them flowing into the river? What are we going to set up in terms of barriers, this kind of thing. The new way of thinking is that we're moving more into this side, which is the indirect causes. And it is a cause and effect relationship. And it's that these are driven by a number of different factors. And the fact is we've been working on this side and not having the kind of impacts that we have. And I said that I would talk about that a little bit more. And there are really two reasons why we're not having the kind of impacts. One is that we haven't been addressing these indirect causes, and they're having they have a tremendous amount of driving force. And the other is that while we've been working here in conservation, spending millions of dollars, say, the private sector and other interests have been spending billions of dollars to undermine a lot of what we're doing here and to drive factors that are actually having a much greater impact than we can have in conservation. So we're actually scaling up our activities to this side to say if we can get to a policy or if we can get to an international development program that takes into account sustainable development, perhaps we could address 5 or 6 of these issues. That's not to say that we're not still working on this side, because we are. But we also have to think about what's behind it all, and not just in terms of environmental policies, financial policies, economic policies. So again, direct versus indirect. And this is how we define it. My department that I work on did studies in 10 countries around the world, starting in 1995 to say what are the typical kinds of direct or indirect factors that are out there. And we now you can see the inner circle there is biodiversity loss. The first circle, the gray circle, are really those indirect causes. Climate change, overharvesting, some of the things that you all mentioned here, habitat loss and alteration, pollution. Now these are general categories, so these aspects would actually fit. These aspects on the left would actually fit under that inner circle. And then that outer circle is this is that cause and effect relationship. The outer circle is actually having the kind of putting pressure on these direct factors that are the first circle. So on the outside we have poverty and inequality, demographic change, macroeconomic policies, markets, public policies, social change and development. Now again, these are general categories, and there are a lot of different aspects underneath each of them, but these are the sort of things we were seeing over and over again in terms of the direct and indirect causes. So now I want to kind of illustrate what we've been talking about in terms of these changes in conservation and ways of approaching conservation in terms of more policy-based aspects by case study in Madagascar and the Spiny forest. Does anybody know what's going on in Madagascar these days?
How many know where Madagascar is?
Ah, that was the first question. Oh, good. Better than I did when they sent me there. So where's Madagascar? On the southeast coast of Africa. Why is it particularly interesting for conservation? Does anybody know? What's that?
It's been isolated for centuries
Yeah.
from
It has.
mainland ecology.
And what's that created?
Uniqueness.
Yeah, uniqueness.
Great biodiversity.
Yep. Endemism, high rates of endemism. Species that occur nowhere else on the planet. So conservation has actually been at work there for 50 years, millions of dollars. Every single major conservation organization has an office in Madagascar, and they're doing work there. Madagascar is also the 14th poorest country in the world. And right now, they're in somewhat, well, not somewhat, they're having civil unrest because in February, a president was elected. The past president said, no, I think that I was supposed to win, and they've basically closed the city down to fuel and any kind of staple fuel, food. So they're losing millions of dollars a day for an economy that is one of the poorest in the world. And it has the highest rates of deforestation as well. So you can see that even with all the money that's coming in for conservation, it's not necessarily having the impact that we need to have unless we start to address the poverty, population, and development policies that are going on. So this is the island of Madagascar. And I mentioned before that we're now working in ecoregions. Madagascar has 4 of our global 200 priority ecoregions. And the spiny thicket, or the spiny forest in the south there, is where I was working, which is what I'm going to talk about now. And this is what makes the spiny forest the spiny forest. It looks to me like kind of an undersea adventure place because it all looks like it's algae growing up from the bottom. But it's very interesting and it's very unique. And it's very threatened. And I don't know how well you can see the picture, but these are bags of charcoal. And families, very poor rural families, will clear the forest. You can see behind the bags of charcoal that it's just flattened. This used to be spiny forest. And so people are cutting the trees, making charcoal, and using it for fuel, for cooking, and also selling it to the urban centers. This is a major source of fuel. So if you can imagine, in this country, if we relied on trees for fuel, for everything, how much forest we would have left.
In the U.S.
And we're talking about the urban centers. This is not just to the rural populations. And the problem is that a lot of the poor people also don't have access to markets. So along the side of the road, which is where this picture was taken, you could buy a bag of charcoal for about 40 cents. And in town, the middleman sells it for about $2.50. So, it's not very expensive, so you wonder about how much they're valuing the natural resource or how well it's being valued. And B, you can see the large discrepancy between what the rural poor are getting and what it's selling for in town and what the middleman is getting. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself because I really just want to talk about the direct causes of biodiversity loss in the spiny forest. And again, it's collection of wood, charcoal, and fuel wood, increased agricultural production both on the small scale and the large scale. It's interesting because sisal is a crop that's grown in Madagascar and parts of eastern Africa, and forests are flattened to grow this crop. It looks like an aloe vera, and it's actually used to create packaging, which is sold in Europe as eco-sensitive packaging because it's not plastic, it's natural fiber, but it's actually decimating the forests in Madagascar. Poor agricultural techniques and wildlife collection. So typically, conservation would stop at that point and say, okay, we've identified the threats, and we start to map them out like this, from looking at impacts on biodiversity, then back from that, hunting of wildlife, habitat degradation, fragmentation, habitat loss from farming and timber harvesting. And then conservationists would say, okay, what are we going to do about it? We have to start to address the commercial farmers, maybe a better practice, family farming. We have to get them to stop doing agricultural extensification, rather than asking why. Why are they doing this? What are the incentive structures that are in place that people are actually engaging in these activities? And so we're now moving on to, again, think about these indirect or root causes. And in this case, it's limited alternative markets. So for the rural poor, they have very few alternatives for how they're going to generate income. They don't have access to cities, urban centers, markets. Roads are very poor and very scarce. And also means of transportation are very rare. Urban energy demand, again, that demand for charcoal in the urban centers is a major issue. Regional management capacity. So there's very little money that goes to the south of Madagascar. So agricultural extension work is just not done. Education, healthcare, things that would also raise living standards don't exist. External market demand, again, the European market for sisal. And international policies. The World Bank has a huge role in defining policies for Madagascar and saying we need to target mining in order to bring in income. We need to increase agricultural production in order to bring in income. Not necessarily thinking about what these policies or incentives are going to do on the ground. And in terms of sustainability, what is it going to mean if you give a push for agricultural extensification, greater crops, greater exports, and then in 10 years you've decimated your forests and you ruin the soil? These things just are not necessarily happening in the minds of the policy makers. And so we try to have an impact there. And so what we come up with, though, is something that's a little more complex. So I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. And you can see now we address these bigger issues, but then we're sort of left with something like this, with, oh my gosh, we have this whole huge complex model. Where do we start? But I'm just going to trace you through one of the aspects, starting at the international level and looking at structural adjustment, which is up there on the top left. Do you all have an idea of what structural adjustment is, structural adjustment policies, when I mention that? So in a country that needs financing, needs resources, they call on, say, the World Bank or the IMF or other development organizations, and they say, we'd like to borrow some money. And the bank says, fine, you can borrow some money, but what you need to do are follow these specific policy prescriptions, which is usually you have to reduce spending in the public sector, you have to open up trade avenues, you have to reduce subsidies, anything that would be unnatural to, say, the market system functioning. I don't know if you all get all of that. But I think you've all heard about trade policies and how it can have an impact on the way people, the way deforestation could then occur because people are trying to grow crops. It affects prices in the country, so goods could become a lot more expensive or a lot cheaper. And so these institutions say you need to follow these particular policy prescriptions or you won't get your funds. And oftentimes these policy prescriptions are not linked to the impacts they're actually going to have on people and the environment. It usually just looks through the narrow window of what's it going to do for the economy. So in this case, we look at the structural adjustment policies that have led to deregulation and reduced government expenditure. And unfortunately, when the government is asked to cut spending where they usually cut it, and this is not just because I have a bias, but we actually have the data for it, but where they usually cut it is in environmental conservation and social services. And it's not so different in this country. And so in this case, it has led to inadequate enforcement. So where the Forest Service was actually having an impact in terms of getting a handle on illegal logging, they've very much lost control because now they might have one forest officer for hundreds of hectares of land, and it's just impossible to do the kind of monitoring enforcement that needs to happen. And so this leads to increased cutting, wood for charcoal and fuel, which leads to biodiversity loss. So it's these kind of linkages that is the work that I do and is, again, where conservation is heading. And then in Madagascar, we've made some preliminary recommendations, which is creating more links to market for more sustainable, high-value products, rather than low-value products where you have to grow more to make the same kind of income. National energy policy that move away from fuel or replace something else. But of course, you need to look at what the impacts of that something else are going to be as well. Capacity building at the local government level to be able to give assistance for, again, better agricultural techniques or links to market. And then at the international level, lobbying for more sustainable development. And that's very much what we're doing at the World Bank this past week, is saying, how can we link up some of the policies that you're talking about to the impacts that we're seeing and have on the ground? And how do we do this? Because, again, it is much more complex than it used to be. We're not now working with a small community and trying to get a community-based forest activity. That's a part of what we do, but again, with a scaled-up approach, we have to think about different partners. So what we need is to bring a whole lot more stakeholders in, people who are involved, people who are going to either be involved in decision-making or that they're going to have impacts on them. And so this is what I do, and this is what I was just doing in Mexico, is sitting around the table with about 60 people from all the different sectors of government. Finance, economists, agriculture, trade exporters, and then we bring in people from the regional offices. And then we bring in local people, the head of campesino, the cattle ranchers, who say, you all need to understand that when we're sitting there and we're cattle ranching and the prices drop, that means that we have to cut back on the inputs that we give into cattle, which means that we have to graze them further out. So if you want to think about conservation, you actually have to think about what the decisions you're making at the national level have on our activities. And so these are the kind of things that we do, and these are kind of the buzzwords that are around Washington now in this type of work. And people talk about capacity building, but it's really giving people the information to make decisions. It's giving them the tools like GIS and others to do the kind of work that needs to be done at this large scale. And it's defining objectives and prioritizing those objectives. And then it's also looking at feasibility. What, in this political contest that exists now, I mean, you know, in the United States, there's certain things we can get done in a Republican government. There's certain things we can get done in a Democratic government. So you have to think about feasibility, defining steps for action, and then, of course, the clincher is always finding funding. And that's a struggle, especially in an economy that at this point seems to be suffering a little bit. And then just to close, I want to just point out 4 reasons why it's actually a benefit to be thinking at this larger scale and to be thinking about some of the root causes that we talked about before, these indirect causes. And that it gives us a much better comprehensive understanding of what's going on. So instead of working very much, again, at the local level, just looking at the situation here, we have a bigger picture. Even if we're still working at the local level, we understand some of those bigger drivers that are going on. And it provides a framework for connecting the social and environment and economic factors that haven't necessarily been done so well before. And then it helps us to determine also what are the most important factors. So we look at that conceptual model and it helps us to make decisions about where we should target our activities. And then again, it helps to build consensus with a lot of different stakeholders, which haven't necessarily come and sat around the table and talked to each other before, which in the end we think is going to be a very positive thing. But it's challenging. And that's it.